Hey, what's up, everybody? This is Casey Davidson with another episode of the Put 'em Back podcast, your source for conservation, everything from oysters to fisheries management, diving into some of the biggest issues with some of the big key players within the conservation space. Today, I am joined with Andy Hollis. Andy Hollis is the state shellfish manager for South Carolina Department of Natural Resources here in the state. Andy, thanks for being here, man.
Yeah, happy to be here.
Awesome. So I've known you for a few years. I don't think I know you that well. Tell me, how does one find themselves being a state shellfish manager?
That's a good question. For me, which I think is, not a typical path to this position. It was in a roundabout way. I started my career in conservation and fisheries back in 2001. Oddly enough, when I went to college, I majored in physics. I'm not a biologist by training. I actually studied physics, and the last semester I had in college, I had left like some of my student loans that I didn't take, and like in order to like get those student loans to enjoy the summer after graduating, I had to take a class. And my girlfriend at the time started taking this marine biology class that summer, and I was like, well, I'll enroll in it, and then I can get my student loans and just have that money. It was poor decision-making financially, but, whatever, I was young. So I took this marine biology class, and I just fell in love with marine biology right now at the end of my college career. I had pretty much already gotten my degree. I had already gotten my degree in physics. I had graduated and everything, and I took this class. But I loved it so much that I applied for an hourly position at the Department of Natural Resources back in 2001. I started working in the shellfish research section at DNR, and man, I just loved it. It was I was passionate about it from day one, and I'm really thankful that I kind of got derailed early on and was able to go down that path. And since then, I've had to leave DNR to work, just to pay the bills. I've worked at I've worked at other state agencies. I've worked in the private sector. I've worked in nonprofits. For instance, I was at the Coastal Conservation League for a good long while.
Man, you got a huge conservation
exactly.
resume. That's awesome.
Yeah. And then just this opportunity came to get back in with the folks in shellfish management at DNR, and I jumped at it, and I've moved up, and I love it. I'm really thankful to be here doing this work.
So what does a state shellfish manager do?
We, not to give a really stupid answer here, but we manage the mollusk and shellfish resources in the state of South Carolina, and that means primarily being a regulatory authority, and then also we are tasked with improving that resource as well. And so we try hard to not only enforce the laws that keep that resource healthy, but also, making sure that by the time I leave, that the resource is better off than when I started.
That's a great goal. I'm going to put you on the spot. How are we doing? How are oysters in the state of South Carolina?
We're not seeing. Our oysters are doing really good. We have we have a great population that I think understands the importance of oysters in our ecosystems, in our estuaries. We work with tens of thousands of volunteers every year doing recycling oysters and cleaning those recycled shells and then building reefs, number one. And then we've been lucky enough to receive a lot of good grants to improve or to expand the way that we're doing restoration. And then, we have, I think there was a great foresight that some of our legislators had in the 1980s when they created the culture permit system of management for oysters. Without getting too deep into that, there are some state shellfish grounds that are permitted to individuals for commercial harvest, and as part of that,
Yeah, I mean, my family has oyster leases we've had down in Beaufort area for generations, for
yeah,
sure.
and as part of that privilege, you're required to do a certain amount of cultivation and husbandry.
Yes, for sure. And so that's where I think maybe the number. So we, Toadfish Conservation Coalition, worked with Ben Dyer back when he was in your position, or I'm in some similar position. But we worked to do a survey to try to get a hold of like what is the recreational harvest number, right? So, just to simplify this for listeners, because you may not be familiar with, oysters in our state, we do have a good wild population of oyster clusters here in South Carolina. You go out at low tide, right along the bank, you're going to see, a ton of oyster beds, right? But from, I think this is where I wanted to dig into the data a little bit. With what we found with how many oysters they estimate are being pulled out from recreational harvest, obviously we have the commercial harvest. The number that I was given annually is that we're pulling out around 120,000 bushels of oysters a year. Does that sound about like a number that you've heard?
I think that's the top end. I mean, the thing is, like,
So
it's
could
all
be-
just
so-
a guess.
Okay, so even if it's 80, right? And
Yeah.
then looking at the numbers that the DNR releases and the South Carolina Department of Natural Resources and the SCORE program, South Carolina Oyster Restoration Enhancement, everything y'all are doing from what I'm seeing, and we've donated to over 10 different programs now across the country, right? And South Carolina, I think by far is the number one state in terms of what is being done and like the breadth of it, right? It's the most organized. That you guys have barges, you have a huge, like you said, you've got all these volunteers that are engaged with this program. You're collecting from a lot of shells from a lot of restaurants. We'll get into that. And then, and then other states are not doing quite as much. But with that being said, the number that I heard is that we're replanting, around 40,000 bushels a year annually through the program through South Carolina. But if we're even taking 80 out, how do we get back to even and get that oyster bed, the oyster population to be the same or to even grow, right? Because an oyster takes 2 years from the time it's,
2 to 3
a
years.
spat to fully mature.
Right.
And I don't want to paint a, dark picture here, right? And I think maybe the intangible, right, is like, are these commercial guys doing what they're supposed to do? Because we're regulating that, right? I remember my cousins down in Beaufort, they had their leases, and they also did crabbing, so they would do crushed crab pots, put those down to that was part of their requirement. So that I don't know if we have the data around, but if you just looked even on the low end, if you're taking 80,000 bushels out and you're putting back 40, you map that out over a 20-year chart, oysters are in trouble from what I'm seeing on the math, or is that not the case?
It's not quite. I mean, the math is kind of fuzzy, and the weird. I mean, the unknown here is that recreational harvest. I mean, commercial harvesters, they're required to report their landings, and so we have those numbers down. Getting back to that culture permit system, they have a responsibility based on that privilege of having sole harvest rights for a public trust resource. They have to plant 50 bushels of credit culch material for every acre of oysters that they have on their lease. And so when you do the math there, the amount that they have to plant every year, for all the commercial folks, for all of the culture permits, it comes out to just south of 100,000 bushels a year. So it is a significant amount of that. And that pretty much gets at the 80 to 100,000 that's harvested every year for commercial harvest. And so that is keeping, I mean, that's a huge piece of our restoration, and that's a huge piece of keeping that shell budget neutral, right? If we didn't have that, then we would be in deep, deep trouble. So I can't express enough how important that the commercial folks are to keeping strangely enough, like to keeping that that
Yeah, and I mean, it
healthy.
seems like it'd be in their best interest, right?
And it is, right?
Right, like if you got a lease, if you got a lease of oysters and you're taking too many and you're not putting enough back,
Yeah,
and then 2 years down the road, you're still got that lease, you're not making any money. So it's in their best interest to take care of their own beds.
Right, exactly.
But we are putting a lot of weight on those folks to be responsible for sure.
It is. We are, and you know, it's in their best interest, like you said, to make sure it's healthy. But it's also in their best interest to make like a really great product too. You know, and so by having ownership in those culture permits, the commercial guys are real advocates and a big piece of that, of keeping that resource healthy. Now, I will say, as we expand that out into that commercial harvest, you know, so that, you know, that's kind of keeping that neutral from a commercial standpoint. But with a recreational harvest, it's really difficult for us to be able to tell how much is actually being harvested.
No doubt.
The only way, I mean, so the way that this has worked in the past is like we will send out a survey to some small number of people who have a shellfish license, who can harvest recreationally, right? And then we'll get like
I mean, anybody can harvest recreationally on public beds.
Yeah, if they have a saltwater fishing license.
Correct.
That's what I mean.
Yeah.
So that's
what is the limit on that? Is it 2 bushels?
Yeah,
per
2 bushels
trip?
per person per day, and then but no more than 3 limits per week, and then
I mean, a bushel of oysters is a lot of oysters.
It is.
1 bushel basket's going to feed.
It is.
6 people.
I was, you know, it was funny. I was, we had our DNR open house last week, and like there were a lot of people who asked me that question. Well, how much can I get? What is the limit? And I was like 2 bushels per person, you know, per day, you know, no more than 3 per week. And they were like, God, I couldn't eat that many oysters, you know. And I was like, so I mean, it's plenty, you know, and especially if you're responsible with it, and that's one thing that we always beat the drum about, is being responsible in your harvesting, to make sure you're doing what we call culling in place. And if you see oysters growing here in Charleston, South Carolina, or I mean the state of South Carolina, they're growing on the bank and they're in big clusters, and you pull up that big cluster. You don't just take that big cluster and put it in your bushel basket. What you want to do is you want to pull that big cluster, break it apart, leave those smaller oysters behind so they can grow and so they can be cultured for new oysters to grow on.
That's great advice, because I've had some friends recently that, you know, have tried to go out, and if you don't really know what you're doing, to know how to do it properly is definitely important. That's a great idea, to bring your little hammer and knock off the the smaller seed oysters, leave those behind.
And we should do a video of that. You know,
for sure.
It'd be great to just illustrate exactly how that's done, because it's not hard, and you end up taking back something that's more pleasant to eat because it's easier to clean. You get more of those bigger oysters, and so that's a big part of that.
Let's jump into the why, right? So, you know, we just talked about a lot of things, but why oysters? Why is the oyster so valuable for our fragile saltwater ecosystem?
Well, we say that oysters are ecosystem superstars, and they really are. I mean, if you look at our estuaries, you know, you kind of see 3 things, and they're a dominant feature of our estuary as you look out onto the marsh. You know, there's water, there's marsh, and there's oysters, and those oysters are playing a big role. I would almost say an MVP there, because, you know, not only are they great to eat? Not only are they, you know, valuable from a commercial standpoint for eating, but you know, an adult oyster can filter up to 50 gallons of water per day.
That's huge. I want to stop there for a second. So, 1 tiny oyster, 50 gallons of water per day.
Yeah.
And it's like 2 inches big.
As much as. Yep.
And I get a lot, like, so we've been doing this a while with Toadfish. You know, we're, you know, around oysters and replanting oysters and just talking about the importance of it. We get lots of messages on this, you know, from a filtering perspective, right? So you got the city of Charleston, where we're at right now. You got all this runoff going in. You got Plum Island. You got, you know, whatever it is. It's going down. It's coming from everywhere. It's coming from Columbia all the way down through and ended up here in the Charleston Harbor.
Right.
So you got all these pollutants in the water. These oysters are filtering that. Mm-hmm. How are they doing this in a way that then we can pick this up and eat it? People ask that all the time. Like, how are they filtering this water and where are they, like, what's happening? How do we not get sick from eating these oysters that are filtering everything out of the water?
Yeah, DHAG, or what used to be DHAG, now it's DES, the Department of Environmental Services. They test the water for fecal coliform levels and enterococci. I'm probably saying that wrong, but they look at pathogens that aren't necessarily bad, but would indicate that there would be that in a high enough concentration, their presence would indicate that those oysters could be dangerous to us, to get us sick. Like that is like the bacteria that would get us sick. And they do a good job. They have, they are following federal standards to ensure that the stuff that you're allowed to harvest, if you're harvesting in a place that's open based on water quality, that it's healthy enough.
That makes sense. So probably like right here in the harbor, those oysters.
They're not.
You
that's
can't
the
harvest,
thing. You can't harvest oysters there.
Yeah, because it's not
closed.
Right,
it's closed for human health reasons. And so
they're a bivalve. They're pulling that water in. They're filtering it through their gills and then pushing that water out. So they're feeding on all kinds of things, all those nutrients. Right. I did Friday. I went and did a little tank demo for a local school here, where I put the water tank out, put the oysters in, and the kids came back and at lunchtime and it was crystal clear. Yeah. That's always a huge hit. So I mean, I've always been told that in terms of like the number one issue that our waters face is water quality. That's the number one reason for fish mortality. And so the oysters obviously playing a primary role.
Absolutely.
In that.
Yeah. I mean, we have trillions of oysters out there. And if you think about the amount of water filtration we're getting from that organism, if you look at all the oysters together as one organism, it's like our liver out there, right? It's keeping.
Wow, that's awesome.
Yeah, it's keeping that estuary healthy, just like your liver would.
That's interesting to think about. But one other interesting historical thing that I saw in Ben's office one time were these giant oyster shells.
Yeah.
And there's a historical work, I forget it was from like the 1600s, that were talking about oysters the size of dinner plates.
Yeah, I mean,
so that's interesting to think about. That would they grow that big over time if we left them alone?
Yeah, and you're talking about those oysters, and those are fossilized oysters, and those things are like, I mean, for the folks listening, they are like a foot long.
Yeah,
like at least a foot long.
Yeah, it's crazy.
I mean, they are huge. You don't see oysters that big anymore, and so there's definitely. I mean, I think that the oysters that we see right now are a little bit different than the stuff we saw in the past, and I don't know. I guess it depends on what order of magnitude you look at, but I mean, that's starting to get into like another reason why oysters are so important is because they've been such a huge part of human culture for the longest time. What's I think really interesting to me, I'll talk to our archaeology folks a good bit, but I don't know if you've heard of shell middens. These are places where...
Are these the shell rings?
Yeah, shell rings. Yeah, shell rings.
Like for the Native Americans and stuff like that.
Exactly. Yeah. So these are essentially like discard piles from oyster roasts that the Native Americans have left behind, and they date back. Listen to this. They date back 4,000 years.
Jeez.
And so to put that into perspective, 4,000 years ago was when they were building the pyramids of Giza. So back when they were building the pyramids of Giza, there were people here eating oysters just like we're eating oysters now.
The Combahee.
Yeah. It's right here, James Island. There's a 10-acre shell midden right here in James Island.
The other oyster superpower is habitat.
Yeah.
I mean, this is the nursery ground for what I've heard is over 100 marine species. Is that right, Andy?
Yeah, over 100. That it's a factor for their survival.
So shrimp, crabs,
all the finfish.
So what about like grouper stuff you catch offshore? Are they using this as nursery grounds too? Snapper, grouper, like some
in some way,
fish?
There's there's certainly shrimp that are around and involved in things that are going then offshore that are then feeding other fish. I mean, everything is connected. You can't. I'm sure that there is a connection.
I can't even name 100 species. I mean, that's wild. That they're using that as a nursery ground to grow up.
It is a lot to think about, but But yeah, they're a critical habitat um, for a lot of crabs, a lot of worms, and those crabs and those worms, those are food for finfish and other bigger crabs and other crustaceans, and then it just goes from there, where those creatures are then important food for other larger things, and it just expands from there, and so.
Yeah, I mean, I think something there to think about is like we worked with some programs up in the Chesapeake Bay. Obviously, you have the Billion Oyster Project in New York Harbor, and when you take all the oysters out of a system for whatever reason, there goes your striped bass population.
Right.
There goes your blue crab population, because there's no place for those species to grow up.
Yeah. And I was at a conference about 6 months ago, and this guy gave a presentation, and I thought it was really interesting. But it actually works both ways too. He was saying that so they had done a survey of some of the oyster beds in what we call the South Atlantic Bight, and that is the area from essentially halfway up Georgia on up to Cape Hatteras. But it's this area of the coast where we have a really high tidal range. And what they had done is they had used fyke nets to capture bonnethead sharks. And they found that these sharks had a bunch of crabs in their bellies. And then he had done a food web experiment, and he'd found that these bonnethead sharks were keeping the larger blue crabs hidden away during high tide, and that as a result, the smaller oysters that were growing were then able to not be eaten. The blue crabs will eat those smaller oysters, and so the sharks are helping the oysters to grow.
Oh my gosh.
And it's crazy to think about. It's mind blowing, but like how close everything is together. So yeah, when you say in the Chesapeake Bay, when you remove all those oysters and those striped bass go away, everything is tied together, and it's critical.
Yeah, I just don't want to see any other places and end up and going through those problems. So and it's so important.
Right.
To put them back, to put your oysters back. Let's talk about a couple more things before we get into the restoration side. I read an article recently, and this one I did not know about. Let's talk about oysters and climate change. Have you heard about this?
I mean, there's I get asked about oysters and climate change a lot and how they're going to adapt, but what'd you hear?
So no, I read an article from what's that one with the panda on it? The huge one, wildlife one, organization. Anyway, it doesn't matter. Basically, that oysters are playing a pretty pivotal role in pulling CO2, carbon dioxide, out of the atmosphere.
Huh.
They apparently extract and store carbon from the atmosphere in pretty large volumes.
I don't know. I haven't. I'd have
I'll
to
send you the
read
article.
that study.
It was pretty cool.
I mean, I will say that, we're getting into like the other big service that oysters provide to us, and that is protecting our marshes, right? And then if you're protecting those marshes, you're protecting those marsh grasses, and there's no question that those marsh grasses are then capturing CO2.
So you're talking about erosion.
I'm talking about
control.
erosion.
Yeah.
Erosion
I
control.
mean, we obviously, with the changing climate, have seen a lot of tumultuous times in terms of big weather events. It looks like we're having hurricanes every year now. Where I was a kid, we had Hugo like when I was like 4 or whatever, and now it seems like there's a major weather event coming all the time. And so, talk to me about that role that the oysters play and keeping that structure in place from waves and all the things that are happening. So.
Well, I mean, since the oysters grow in clusters on intertidal banks, they are essentially a natural breakwater for the marshes, and they're protecting those marsh grasses from being eroded by high wave energy, whether that's from boats, whether that's from storms, whether that's from any number of factors that could lead to marsh erosion, and so. And so that's a critical piece to maintaining the resilience of our coast.
Yeah, that's pretty awesome. the oyster, what did you say? The oyster super... what was it?
Ecosystem superstar.
Ecosystem superstar. That's a new one. I'm going to have to start using that when I do my kids' events.
I mean, you can't argue against it, if you think about all the stuff that they do for us here.
That's amazing. So what can our listeners do to help? Obviously, oysters are vitally important to our ecosystem. What are some things that they can do to help make sure that we have oysters for generations to come?
I mean, there's a lot. Where do I start? A lot of the work that we do, a lot of the restoration is funded by what people pay for their saltwater fishing licenses. So it's just as simple as like getting a saltwater fishing license. That's helping us. If you want to help a little bit more, come and volunteer with us. We have a lot of opportunities there. You can come,
and it's so fun.
And it's a lot of fun.
It's awesome,
and you make good friends. And I mean,
we've done the wire reef buildings.
Yeah.
We've done the shell bagging. We even went a couple weeks ago and pulled trash out of the big piles of oysters that you guys have ready to go in.
Yeah.
That wasn't as much fun because of the gnats, but yeah, there's a ton of volunteer opportunities with the SEDNR SCORE program. We'll provide the link for that if you want to get involved directly. But some indirect stuff though, I think the most important thing that I want to see happen in my lifetime is, it's similar to the stigma around taking your plastic water bottle and throwing it in the garbage, right? Where does that go? It goes in the recycling bin.
Right.
And what do most folks have done? I remember my parents did it, not putting you on blast, Dad, but, you have the oyster roast and you're like, oh, wow, I got a pothole in the driveway. Let's crush these up and let's put these oyster shells there.
Right.
Or they just go right in the trash because they smell, you want to get rid of them.
Yeah.
But our environment needs those old shells back.
Yeah.
And so let's move into the recycling piece of this. I don't know if y'all know this, but the DNR actually has to buy a lot of the shell that they need to get to that 40,000 bushels replanted per year, because if we're taking 100,000 bushels out, we should be getting that much back in shell to recycle. But we're not, because folks are being lazy. They're not taking it seriously. And I think if you're going to have an oyster roast in the state of South Carolina, it is your responsibility to be a steward of those shells and find a Dropbox location near you and take those shells back.
Absolutely agree. Yeah.
And that's, for me, the number one thing that you can do to participate in this program is be a steward. You're having an oyster roast. One other thing that DNR does that's awesome is if you have a big party, you can call them and they'll bring bins to you if you have a certain amount of shell. But we also can provide a link to that as well. There's also a link that we'll provide for all the drop-off locations in the state of South Carolina. We were able to fund a few of those over the years, which is great. And it's just locations where you take your shells back, you drop them off, and they kind of let them sit out for what, like 6 months? 6 months, Andy?
Yeah, we let them cure for 6 months.
And what is that for? Just
there's a lot of those shells that come from other states, and so to reduce the risk of introducing any kind of disease that might affect our natural populations, that gives them time. That all the meat that's inside it, that gives that time to rot away and go away and not affect our natural populations.
So then you take those shells, and there's a variety of ways that you put them. We talked about the wire reef building. We talked about bagging, but probably the primary is you just pick them up. We put them on. Y'all put them on this big barge.
Exactly.
We went out before. We funded a few of these, acre plus reefs.
Yeah.
Water cannon shoots the shell back into the water.
Right.
You guys do it in the summertime. When the oysters are spawning. Just walk us through that quickly from the time that shell goes back into the water. How is that old shell, which is kind of magical, honestly, turning into a new oyster reef?
So in the summer, the way that oysters reproduce is they spawn. So they'll release sperm and eggs into the water, and those will fertilize in the water column. It'll turn into a little... a small swimming creature that looks for a place to settle, and somehow they have the instinct to settle on other oysters. And so that's what we're doing, is we're providing that, what we call culch material, for them to then settle on to then grow into adult oysters. And so that's the most effective way of doing oyster restoration, is to provide culch material in the form of oyster shell.
That's amazing that they prefer to grow on old oysters.
Yeah.
Or I've heard like maybe that if they do land on an old oyster, maybe that old shell just has exactly what that baby needs in terms of a calcium content or something like that, versus like landing on a rock or a. Because I mean, if you look like on a bridge piling, those oysters don't look as healthy and big as they do on a reef.
Right. And I mean, there's an advantage to them clustering together, because if they're all together and they create this hard structure, they're able to create their own protective area, so it makes sense from an evolutionary standpoint that that's how they behave. But the actual mechanism behind how they know, is totally a mystery.
Yeah, but I mean, in a nutshell here, like the environment needs these shells back. Bottom line, like you should be embarrassed to put your shells into the garbage bin. These don't belong in the landfill. When you have an oyster roast, when you open oysters, those shells belong back in the environment from where they came. And that's the number one thing I think you can do to participate, no matter where you are. Find your recycling program. We're lucky enough here in the state that we have a lot of funding around this, and a lot of infrastructure built. Like I said, one of the best. Congratulations on what you've done. I know it's a labor of love, honestly.
Yeah.
Being a state actor here in this space is really, you're doing it because you're passionate about it,
right? Because
it's important.
Yeah, and we have the most successful recycling program in the nation. I think it's close with the Billion Oyster Project, but I think we're still ahead of the game here.
100%.
So it's something really that we're proud of.
One more thing as well. Let's talk about recycling from restaurants.
Okay.
So how many restaurants are we picking up from now in the state, and how do we expand and get more shells back from restaurants?
We have currently 119 restaurants that are participating in our oyster shell recycling
119?
program. 119.
Wow, that has grown so much from 7-8 years ago when I started Toadfish.
And again, it's so much more than from other states. There was a paper recently in the Journal of Shellfish Research, and they did a survey, and a lot of these places,
the closest other one was like 15, probably.
It was like,
and it's down in New Orleans because we
Yeah.
worked in that program as well.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so we're killing it there, but we're not getting everywhere. And the biggest limitation we have is just it's hard for us to get our staff, who are based here in Charleston, out there to Murrells Inlet to collect all the shells there, out there in Greenville to
Buford
collect, and Buford's doing okay, but still we could use some help there. And so, like, again, this is another opportunity that folks can volunteer. If you want to, reach out to me and Holly Kite, who's our recycling lead. If you live in those areas and you want to help a lot, picking up and being able to get those restaurants. This is so
interesting. I'm so glad you brought this up, because there was a program that I'll have to find the name of it. Sorry, my brain is just terrible sometimes, but it was like 2 dudes in a truck around the Savannah area, I think it was. Somewhere in Georgia, and they were like reaching out. They were so passionate about this. They were literally taking their pickup truck to restaurants, picking up shells and bringing them.
Well, this is how we started.
I mean, and I would love to have folks be that energized, where they're like, hey, we're not getting the service we need because of the, the closest drop-off area the DNR is servicing is here.
Mm-hmm.
Every other week, I'm going to take my pickup truck and go grab these shells and move them for the state. I mean, what an amazing volunteer opportunity.
And that's how the restaurant route started with us, was that it was some retirees down in Beaufort that wanted to help. They were involved in the SCORE program. They were bagging shell. They saw the importance of recycling that shell, and so they had their old, it was like they were retired and they had an Outback that they were going to restaurants. Heroes, and they were getting these buckets and they were bringing them, and that's how it started, and it's grown from there.
That's amazing.
So yeah, if you are living in, I think we're doing pretty good in Charleston, but certainly if if you want to help with the restaurant route and getting a restaurant on board, adopt a restaurant and get the shelves.
Hey, restaurants.
Yeah.
If you want to participate, please reach out to the South Carolina Department of Natural Resources oyster restoration program. Participate in this. It matters. You know, we're making money off these oysters. We need to be stewards of them. So if you're a restaurant not participating, please consider participating. I know it's difficult. There's a little bit associated with smell. There's a little bit associated with having folks sort the product out when you're bussing tables to the correct bin. I mean, it's definitely not something that's easy, but things that are important sometimes are not easy.
Exactly.
Go build some wire reefs, have some fun, meet some new friends, go get your feet dirty, go out on these builds, get out in the mud. Those are so fun. Walking out in the mud, putting these bags back, wear some bug spray, sweat a little bit, get a good pair of rubber boots. It's so cool to get your hands on something and then be able to go back and look on Google Earth. If you get a low tide shot, zoom in and be like, I planted that habitat. Yeah. That reef right there is going to be in this area that's close for harvest. It's going to be producing baby redfish, trout, flounder, crabs, shrimp for generations to come. And it's something tangible you can put your hands on and you can physically do. You don't need $1 to go out and volunteer and plant oysters with the Department of Natural Resources. It's a free opportunity for you to invest your time and energy in something that, in my opinion, is the most important thing we can do for our environment. So sorry to steal the thunder here. I'm pretty passionate about this one.
It is. It's important for people to do that. I love it. I mean, I come over the James Allen Connector every day when I'm on my way to work, and I look over off the side at Wapu Cut, and you can see all the oyster reefs that we've built there and the marsh growing back behind it. And and I was a part of those builds, and I've spoken to people who are like, yeah, I helped build there at the Wapu Cut, and I come over that bridge and I see that, and it's just great to see that. That's just something I did. It's that kind of volunteer opportunity where it's instant gratification. One, because you see the reef there, but then it keeps building because you then can, like, maybe if it's somewhere that you can see it on the regular, you can see those oysters start to grow. And then you start to see the marsh coming back in behind it, and you're like, man, yeah, we did that.
Yeah, and then you go back and throw a topwater over top of it and catch a trout.
And then catch a
like,
trout.
Wow.
There we go, yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah,
well, thank you so much for coming in, Andy. I really appreciate your time, and I truly appreciate what you do. I mean, again, like I can definitely see your passion, and it's amazing to have folks like you that are being stewards of our shared resources and dedicating your life to the environment. It's very amenable, and I mean, it's just can't thank you enough for what you do.
Thanks, Casey. I appreciate that, and certainly we couldn't do it without the help from our partners like Toadfish and others who have supported us. Just continue to grow this program. So.
Yeah, the other cool thing that we're working on, just a little sneak preview, we've got two things kind of working with Andy right now coming this summer. We're going to partner with Live Paddleboards, and we're donating a fair amount of paddle boards for our marsh grass replanting program here in South Carolina, which will be super fun. Also an amazing volunteer opportunity where you actually just get to go out and paddleboard at high tide in the marsh and plant baby marsh grass that Andy and his team is growing. And number two is the Green Shell program.
Green Shell
Relay program. Tell us just high level real quick about what that program's about.
Sure. I mean, because oyster shell that we plant is a limited resource, we look at other ways of improving the oyster beds. And one of those ways is essentially it's a lot like weeding a garden. Like if you planted a bunch of tomato seeds and you had all those tomato seeds growing really in close and they can't quite grow, what we're doing is we're taking some of those tomato plants out, and then we're planting them somewhere else so that the area where we're taking them out, they're able to grow nice and big and healthy. Number one, and then two, we're creating, a new bed of tomatoes.
Whole new garden.
Yeah, but we're doing that with oysters, and so we're going out. The idea here is that we're finding those oyster beds that are growing really dense, that can continue that could maybe even benefit from having some of that density removed, removing some of those oysters, cultivating that bed so that it can grow, and then taking those oysters and establishing a new bed somewhere else. And that's what we're calling green shell relay.
And that's an exciting. I'm very excited about that program for sure because it's something we can do year round.
Right.
And I think we're gonna look to partner together to figure out some type of small barge type vessel that we could use to pull up on these reefs and quickly load the shell and move. And then also provide additional volunteer opportunities like more year round where we can be doing this relay program. So pretty excited about that. Well, thank you again. And thanks y'all for tuning in to the Put 'em Back podcast. This is the best thing you can do. Recycle your shells and let's put them back.